Onward and upward to our penultimate chapter of Matthew. Just finished watching the funeral of Prince Philip, and hopefully this isn't as belaboring, since as we heard there, the mind cannot endure what the backside cannot. So moving on. Matthew 27. This time, the fulfillments of Jeremiah. And we will again continue in that fulfillment theme. And try not to belabor the unicorn mascot that we've been playing with. Once again, we have a number of fulfillments and a multitude of difficulties as well. We'll try to address most of them in the study, and we'll try to address them in order, but then Matthew's order was a bit off as well. First off, we clearly see the prophecy of Jeremiah being fulfilled in verse 9, right? Okay, not so clearly then. Did Matthew actually make a mistake there, or did later scribes make a mistake there? Some folks clearly think so, but it doesn't seem to bother their sense of inerrancy whatsoever. To their defense, it's pretty hard to identify where this prophecy actually came from. And Calvin, well. Yeah, Jeremiah does speak about a potter several times in that book of his. It just doesn't seem to parallel Judas. Now, as near as we can tell, this may be a conflated prophecy, a hulkish smashing together. Say that again. A hulkish smashing together of several obscure chapters in Jeremiah. Starting with Jeremiah having some symbolic pottery made by him, made for him by a certain potter in chapter 18. They reconstituted, we used that word before, reconstituted piece of clay now, since the original design went a little wonky on the potter's wheel, apparently. Little wonky due to what appears to be a temporary hands-off condition by the potter in the sky. In the subsequent chapter, we get an account of his dramatic smashing of that especially made pottery. An account of his smashing that pottery in front of those three crooked shepherds. Yeah, three crooked shepherds that I mentioned in our previous study. Go there to check them out. A smashing account that was intended to be an object lesson to the crooked kings of Judah, as well as to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. An object lesson neither grasped nor heeded. They did not repent. A lesson that they are about to get smashed in the very near future, about their beloved Jerusalem being effectively destroyed, with about 25% of the population being dragged kicking and screaming to Babylon. I'm thinking the song Jerusalem, do 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 do. Should have played that at the funeral. With those two earlier chapters being smashed together with a follow-up in chapter 32, a chapter about Jeremiah being commanded to purchase some pretty significant land by the Lord. Land that was semi-overrun and done by Babylon. To purchase semi-conquered land somewhere around the allotted town of the priests and the Levites, as if that holy purchase would stymie the invasion somewhat, would turn the tide on that imminent invasion, land that the Jews would not return to for another 70 years. Land that is somewhere near Anata in Israel. Anata, a town that is about 3 miles northeast of present-day Jerusalem. A town that is thought by some to house the highly coveted Ark of the Covenant, since priests tend to covet those priestly things and they may have hid them at the time. Doubt it. So quite understandably, archaeology is now being encouraged in Anata, encouraged by evidential Christians and encouraged by Orthodox Jews. Archaeology to precipitate end times, presumably, or reinstitute the sacrifices. Ancient archaeology to refute highly lauded Dr. William Dever, perhaps, or whose puny exodus and providence was most recently challenged by Baltz and Fritz. You can check that out there. Pretty fascinating. With Jeremiah then being commanded to store the official deed of that significant land inside some leak-tight pottery for safekeeping, as if that proof of ownership will actually be useful to Israel someday, will prove that those priests are the rightful owners, like indigenous people reclaiming their land or something like that. With that landowning chapter of Jeremiah 32 supposedly being most relevant to the present fulfillment of this chapter of Matthew, despite it speaking to a field being bought for 17 shekels rather than 30 shekels. Inflation, I suppose. What do you expect after 6 centuries, right? Though the reason it is called the potter's field is a pretty obscure concept in Matthew, since the potter never actually bought this field. Jeremiah did. And it is strange that they would call it that when the potter is just a superfluous detail in Jeremiah. Just a clayman argument. It would be a more clear concept, however, with the Zechariah passage that we spoke to in our last study. With Zechariah 11 more accurately speaking to 30 shekels being thrown into the house of the Lord. Those 30 shekels that Judas also threw in angst and anger, his own inept way of washing his hands of the whole affair. As an inept act of repentance. Inept. At least Pilate disclaimed responsibility in the very face of Jesus. Which is to say, that parallel account of Judas would have been far more obvious to those naming that resultant potter's field in accordance with Zechariah rather than with Jeremiah, especially in light of the Lord plainly saying to Jeremiah, throw it to the potter. Read that, verse 13 of Zechariah 11. Despite those priests being far from potters. Yeah, whereas Jeremiah is basically told to throw some pottery on the ground and store some pottery underground. With the point of Matthew being that those shekels bought a semi-significant field. They bought a cemetery not too far from Jerusalem. They bought an ugly field where all the useful clay had been stripped away, according to Calvin. A bargain basement site that was then made available for the poor, for strangers, and even for criminals to be buried. Criminals like you and like me. A site not at all like the very rich and powerful claiming the marvelous Mount of Olives for a burial site. Buried overlooking glorious Jerusalem, in order that they will be resurrected first when the Messiah finally arrives. Yeah, little more than fanciful thinking. With the symbolic point of the added burial site being that salvation is now made available to us contemptible Gentiles. Or at least according to the highly renowned Craig Blomberg, who feels that making room to be buried equals making room to be married to Christ. Isn't that alliteration for you? Huh? But as our R.T. France said earlier, that is stretching things a wee bit, especially in light of the multitude of Gentiles coming to Christ earlier. even those contemptible Samaritans. Next, in our next great puzzle is our bizarre boxing match between bad old Pontius Pilate and the presumably pious crowd that is hyper concerned about blasphemy, with non-Jew Pilate actually trying to defend a Jew from those spurious charges, yet grossly underestimating the local hostility towards Galilean Jews, as well as underestimating their peculiar support of a local prisoner, their support of a local revolutionary that was very closely associated with murder, as you read there. Yes, their support of Barabbas. Yes, Barabbas. Or Jesus Barabbas, perhaps, if you insist on a praenomen as well as a cognomen. But we'll get to that in a bit. With Pilate and his wife desiring to release the real Jesus, not to release a seditious impostor. No. With Pilate and his wife quite possibly becoming Christians afterward, as you might read in this monetary monograph. Should I read a little bit to you? Would that belabor things too much? Well, yeah, go to Wikipedia. You'll find that there. But, yeah, fascinating stuff. Fascinating stuff. Just plug in Pontius Pilate. Cool. Desiring to release Jesus under the influence of some uninformed angel that did not know the immediate plan, that did not get the memo, apparently. A heavenly messenger that plied Pilate's wife with a most disturbing dream the night before. Plied her like a potter with clay. An angel that presumably did not know, just as the devil himself did not know, the radical game plan of salvation. A devil that actively incited the crowd to cry, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" A devil that actively pursued this excruciating separation between the Father and the Son, with the faint hope that it would be a permanent separation. Yeah, a highly advantageous divide and conquer plan by the devil, not unlike his earlier temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. A plan that worked so well in the garden to take down Adam and Eve. However, neither angels nor demons were about to thwart the eternal plan of God. Indeed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, Gentiles and the people of Israel, were not about to thwart what God had predestined, as you will read in Acts 4. No, God had a far bigger plan in mind, an enormous plan of unity instead. Moving on. What is happening with respect to the scarlet robe of Matthew, or the purple robe of Mark? Two distinctly different colors, right? Well, we need not trouble ourselves about that, according to Calvin. Those are mere trifles, supposedly. But for those of us who are actually troubled by it, our eminent textual critic Philip Comfort says that Mark actually borrowed that scarlet idea from Matthew. Frankly, scarlet. So much for Markan priority, right? Or at least borrowed it in a few Caesarean manuscripts, in some very late 9th century manuscripts. But apart from those oddball manuscripts, it is purple. Oh, purple? We got any purple here? Oh, kind of. We sort of got a purple unicorn. I don't see this unicorn. It's pretty hard to find these unicorns, man. Unicorns, magically delicious. Unicorn, purple, and there's some scarlet in there too. Cool. Blue, anyway. Yum. Yeah, purple and scarlet. Just purple. As in John 19, and Jesus may have been clothed in purple as well as crimson, as you might read in the first chapter of Isaiah, arrayed in purple and scarlet, just like the woman of Revelation 17:4, perhaps. A pretty striking combo. Oh, tasty combo too. Well, at least purple-loving Luke thought it was simply gorgeous anyway. Now, those Caesarean manuscripts also account for that awkward name of Jesus Barabbas as well, that you will find in verse 17 of this chapter. The great polyglot Origen, around then, claims to have seen that awkward name in some manuscripts while staying in Caesarea. A name most peculiarly smashing together the ultra-awkward name Jesus, Yeshua, Joshua, whatever, with the hyper-ambiguous name Barabbas. A last name which means little more than Son of Man. Son of Man. As if that explained his ancestry all that much, right? Yet in order to be perfectly transparent, that unsubstantiated observation of Origen's was added to our super inclusive NIV. It was not in our older NIV, but to be perfectly fair, that confusing and irreverent name probably only deserved to be in the footnotes. Even if that illegitimate name was in fact correct. Even if. The next confusion we have is with another fulfillment, with Jesus echoing Psalm 22 yet again, echoing the very first verse with the blended Hebrew Aramaic saying of Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. Don't want to go with that. There's a blend there with sabachthani or shabachthani blend going on. Anyway, with that Eli, Eli sounding a bit like Elijah, apparently. But with a Galilean accent and with some extreme breathing strathers being applied to the time. That confusion, that mishearing, yes, a mishearing like this, is perfectly understandable. Jesus was definitely not summoning Elijah for a lifeline. No, he was not, nor was he summoning Moses. No, he was still relying on the aid of the Father. And instead, that Elijah misrepresentation was likely just facetious mocking by the onlookers. After all, the forsaken me part is totally inescapable. Psalm 22. Totally inescapable. France then suggests that since Jesus referred to the Father as God at this point, that there was some radical separation now. A separation that dissolved, that eventually dissolved with the final cry of Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Finally, Matthew may be excused for failing to relate the actual contents of the final time that Jesus cried out in a loud voice. Excused since that committing of his spirit would just be distracting to his ongoing fulfillment theme, despite it truly being fulfilled. His spirit was committed to the Father, not somewhere else. Now, In our next difficulty is whether or not Jesus actually drank the wine offered to him on the cross, as if he was a perfect Nazarite or something. We've dealt with that earlier. As if he never drank wine, the Last Supper even. Let's pass on that. Although it's altogether possible that two types of wine were offered to him at two different times. Calvin thinks. Wine mixed with gall, as well as wine mixed with sedative, perhaps. But tasting is not the same as drinking, as any professional coffee cupper will tell you. One has a lasting impression, while the other does not. At any rate, this mock offering fulfills the galling prophecy of David in Psalm 69:21, if you can grant that random prophecy. Whether you do or not, doesn't matter. Our very next fulfillment is likely a dividing of his clothes, as per Psalm 22:19. A division as per the casting of lots, to be more specific. No real difficulty there either, if you know anything about gambling. The next difficulty we have is chronological. It is Matthew saying that Jesus was crucified about noon until 3 in the afternoon. Oh, is it noon yet? Hard to tell. The sun in the sky anyways. That's all they had to rely on. Sundial, somewhat, somewhere, and maybe a water jug. Well, crucified from noon until 3 in the afternoon. Or at least there was a highly unusual darkness at that point in time. A time consistent with what John was saying, that it was about the 6th hour of the day that they handed him over. Yes, consistent with the time that they quite visibly raised him up on a cross. Whereas Mark may have anticipated the actual crucifixion a wee bit, saying that Jesus was well on his way to being crucified at the 3rd hour of daylight already. That it was definitely a done deal after the 3 shepherds had rendered their majority decision of blasphemy. Blasphemy. We spoke to that earlier. A decision ratified by the public soon after that, with Jesus getting seriously beat up in the interim. A crucifixion of sorts. Next, we come to the fulfillment of Isaiah 53:12, in which Jesus was formerly numbered with the transgressors, numbered by having a sign of his crime placed above his head before elevating him. Yeah, above his head, not his hands, like goofy Jehovah's Witnesses will tell you. A highly visible sign. Lots of writing. Mocking him, as well as mocking those fearful shepherds. Shepherds about to be destroyed. At which time we now have the apparent fulfillment of yet another ancient prophecy, a prophecy that he was being justly punished by God. But as prophecies often go, we know that he was unjustly punished on our behalf instead. Thoroughly punished, however, taking up our pain and suffering that is often over-enthusiastically depicted by certain preachers and by a certain movie, according to our R.T. France. Anybody guess who did that movie? Then we come to his inevitable death. Now, this was not some torture stick intended to extract some lame confession of blasphemy, as Jehovah's Witnesses will have you believe. No, this was the killing floor. You see, when your legs are broken on the cross, you are definitely done. You will suffocate very, very quickly, as any Red Cross trainee will tell you. You will be clinically dead in less than 10 minutes. Just like that guy. And brain dead long before that. But they didn't have to resort to breaking his legs. Not like the other criminals. You see, no flinching when he was stabbed with that spear is a pretty good indication that he was pretty dead at the time. The cardiac arrest was complete. Not only that, but there was plenty of zero breathing to indicate as much. The centurion was well aware of when he breathed his last. You can read that in Mark. Yes, one notable final exhale, followed by 10 minutes without any signs of movement, is a really, really good indication. This was not rocket science, Bill Nye. The men were convinced, and the women were convinced. And the novel swoon theory that you may have heard about, well, that is simply laughable. That is a theory befitting Muslims and chauvinistic folks like Derek Chauvin. Now, would you really like to identify with them? Would you? Also, the fact that Jesus was definitely dead was illustrated by various other events. An earthquake and rocks randomly splitting was an event terrifying enough to convince a certain centurion and those along with him that something very, very wrong had just happened. Now, whether that was a lasting conviction or not remains to be seen. I'm looking forward to seeing that. There's also some remote evidence that a curtain was torn in two. A certain curtain. Now, unbelieving Josephus, the historian, claims that some curtain repair material was found when the temple was sacked in 70 AD. And there is some remote evidence from another Jew that the doors to the temple would mysteriously open from that point on. Well, isn't that inviting? But of course, you are really wondering about the zombies that appeared around the same time that Jesus reappeared. Yes, the zombies that I promoted on the last go-round of Matthew 27, 8 years ago. And you have a perfect right to be skeptical of that bizarre resurrection. And it doesn't really matter anyway. However, our RT France is not so skeptical. Neither is the not so definite NT Wright, who grants this may have actually happened. This may. What's that saying? Happened in accordance with the very early chapter of Job. Job 19. Which we heard portion of with Prince Philip's funeral today. You heard that in the song. That was cool. Happened in accordance with various Psalms in Ezekiel 37, Isaiah 26, and the more contemporary Daniel 12. As the sister of Lazarus, as she mentioned in John 11:24, bodily erection was certainly not unheard of at that point. And it didn't necessarily have to be on the last day either, as Jesus affirmed with Lazarus and other folks that he raised from the dead. Different type of resurrection, nonetheless. Those strangely resurrected zombies may have been local folk. Yes, holy folk, like Seeker Simeon, or like temple magnate Anna, or perhaps the once mute Zacharias, maybe even the less mute John the Baptist himself, folks that the locals would have readily recognized. It had given them some consternation, I imagine. Yeah, holy folk, graciously raised to see the most significant fulfillment of all time. The most significant event of all time. The resurrection of the Son of God. The long-awaited Messiah.